Now, here's where the story takes a turn most people don't expect. Because it's easy to blame ancient invaders. It's easy to picture soldiers with hammers, smashing priceless art. It's easy to imagine war and chaos, destruction happening in the heat of battle. That's the story we're often told, right? The simple one. But what if I told you that some of the most significant damage didn't happen during war at all? What if some of it happened during what was called research? What if it happened during preservation? During exploration? What if the very people claiming to protect African history were sometimes the same ones reshaping it to fit their own narrative? Not with swords, not with fire, but with tools that seemed harmless. With labels that quietly rewrote stories, with brushes that scrubbed away context along with the dirt, with catalog numbers that stripped artifacts of their spiritual and cultural meaning, reducing them to mere objects, and with quiet decisions made behind the closed doors of museums, thousands of miles away from the communities that created them. This wasn't a loud, violent conquest. It was a silent one. A conquest of meaning. When European archaeologists and anthropologists arrived in Africa during the colonial era, they weren't just digging for artifacts. They were digging for a version of history that suited them. They controlled the narrative. They decided what was important, what was primitive, and what was worthy of display in their grand institutions. Artifacts that told complex stories of advanced African societies were sometimes misinterpreted, or worse, ignored. Statues were given new, incorrect names. Sacred objects were labeled as simple tools. The intricate web of a culture's beliefs, traditions, and history was untangled and rewoven into a simpler, more digestible story for a Western audience. A story that often reinforced colonial ideas of superiority. This wasn't just about collecting things, it was about controlling the past. And by controlling the past, you control the present and the future. The damage wasn't just physical breakage. It was a breakage of legacy, a severing of connection between a people and their heritage. And this is the quiet cover-up that we are only now beginning to fully understand and confront. Fast forward, thousands of years pass. Empires rise and fall. Temples sink into the sand. And magnificent statues collapse, their secrets buried with them. Great cities, once bustling with life, disappear beneath the endless desert. For a long, long time, the ancient world sleeps, covered, hidden, protected by the slow march of time itself. Then comes the 1700s and the 1800s. The age of European expansion dawns. This is an era of ships crossing vast oceans, flags being planted in what was, to them, foreign soil. Maps were redrawn, entire continents reshaped by distant hands. Africa was divided like a pie at a dinner table, with little regard for the people who lived there. This was the age of colonialism. But colonialism wasn't just about controlling land and resources. It was about something far more powerful. The control of knowledge. Because knowledge is power, and whoever gets to write history, well, they own the story. So, European explorers, soldiers, and scholars started fanning out across the globe. They arrived in Egypt, in Mesopotamia, inlands rich with forgotten history. Armed with shovels and a sense of entitlement, they began to dig. They called it archaeology, a noble pursuit, the quest for knowledge, or so they sighed. But was it really? Imagine this. A team of British archaeologists in the 1880s, standing in the Valley of the Kings. They've just uncovered a pharaoh's tomb, untouched for 3,000 years. The air is thick with dust and discovery, golden chariots, intricate jewelry, stone sarcophagi covered in hieroglyphs. It's the find of a lifetime. But where does it all go? Does it stay in Egypt, the land of its creators? No. Crate after crate is packed up and shipped off to London, to Paris, to Berlin. The treasures of a civilization become exhibits in a foreign museum. This wasn't just a one-time thing. It was a system. From the Elgin marbles taken from Greece to the Benin bronzes plundered from modern-day Nigeria, a pattern emerges. The story being told was a European one. These objects weren't presented as the achievements of vibrant, sophisticated African or Middle Eastern cultures. Instead, they were framed as relics of a dead past, rescued from neglect by a superior civilization. The narrative was subtle but clear. We discovered it, we saved it. Therefore, we own it. This process created what we can call a silent cover-up. The very act of removing these artifacts from their homes stripped them of their context. A statue of a god isn't just a piece of art. It's an object of worship, a focal point for a community. A royal mask isn't just a beautiful bronze. It's a sacred part of a coronation ceremony. When you put it in a glass case thousands of miles away, it loses that meaning. It becomes just a thing to be looked at. The story of its people, their beliefs, their traditions, gets muted, sometimes erased entirely. And this created a distorted view of history. European museums became the self-appointed gatekeepers of world culture. They decided which stories were important and how they should be told. And for a long time, the story they told was that history, real history, was something that happened in Europe. The rest of the world was just a footnote, a source of exotic artifacts. Think about the message this sends. For generations, people from colonized countries have had to travel to Europe to see their own heritage. Their history was held captive, presented through a colonial lens. It's a powerful way to reinforce a sense of cultural inferiority. It quietly says, your past isn't truly yours until we validate it. Now, fast forward to today. The world has changed. The old empires have fallen. Countries have reclaimed their independence, and a new conversation is happening. A loud one. Nations are demanding their stolen heritage back. Egypt wants the Rosetta Stone from the British Museum. Nigeria is demanding the return of the Benin bronzes. Greece continues its fight for the Parthenon marbles. This isn't just about returning old objects. It's about rewriting the story. It's about decolonizing our museums and our minds. It's about acknowledging that the history of humanity doesn't belong to one group of people to display as they see fit. It's a shared story, and every culture has a right to be its own storyteller. The fight for repatriation is a fight for historical justice. It's about breaking the silence and finally letting these amazing artifacts tell their full, true stories back where they belong. The conversation is shifting, but there's a long way to go. What do you think? Should museums return these items? Let me know in the comments below. Have you ever walked through a museum, marveling at ancient Egyptian artifacts, and wondered how they all got there? The story we're often told is one of heroic discovery, but the truth is a lot more complicated. Let's go back to the 19th and early 20th centuries. European explorers arrive in Egypt and Sudan, lands rich with the treasures of ancient civilizations, but pay close attention to the language they used to describe themselves. They didn't call themselves treasure hunters or looters, even though that's what many were doing. No, they called themselves archaeologists, scholars, scientists, men of discovery. It sounds so noble, doesn't it? So respectable. It paints a picture of brave adventurers carefully unearthing history for the good of all mankind. But what actually happened on the ground? Picture this. Vast teams of local Egyptian and Sudanese workers are hired for pennies. They do all the back-breaking work digging in the scorching sun, moving tons of earth and stone, and carefully extracting priceless artifacts from their ancient resting places. They are the ones with the local knowledge, the skill, and the endurance. Yet, when the work is done, who gets the credit? The European archaeologist who stands by, overseeing the operation, often from the shade of a tent. He's the one who poses for the photographs. His name is the one that gets published in the papers back home, and he's the one who decides where these treasures go. And where do they go? Not to local museums in Cairo or Khartoum. They are packed into crates and shipped thousands of miles away to fill the halls of museums in London, Paris, Berlin, and Boston. These artifacts, the very soul of a nation's heritage, are taken to become centerpieces in foreign collections. The local people who unearth them are erased from the story. Their contributions are forgotten, their labor uncredited. This wasn't just a few isolated incidents. It was a system, a colonial enterprise dressed up as scientific pursuit. The discovery was really a removal. The preservation was really a possession. And museums became the grand showcases for this looted heritage, presenting it with neat little labels that tell a sanitized story of archaeological expeditions, conveniently leaving out the part about colonial power, exploitation, and the silencing of the true discoverers. It's a silent cover-up that has shaped how we see ancient history for generations. So the next time you're in a museum, look a little closer at that mummy sarcophagus or that golden statue. Ask yourself the uncomfortable questions. How did it really get here? And whose story isn't being told? Imagine it's early morning. The desert air is still cold, but the sun is already beginning its climb. On T-ground, local workers are digging, their sweat mixing with the sand. Brushes scrape, shovels move earth, and then a sound, the unmistakable thud of metal hitting stone. A shape emerges, a face from the ground, a statue, buried for centuries, perfectly preserved. A king, a queen, a god. Features intact, nose intact, identity intact. For thousands of years, it lay untouched, a silent testament to a glorious past. And then, foreign hands lift it from the soil. They wrap it in cloth, load it onto a cart, and begin a long journey. But this journey isn't to a nearby village or an African university. It's a journey across the sea, to London, Paris, Berlin, New York. Taken, catalogued, displayed, thousands of miles from home, a cultural orphan in a foreign land. This story isn't just about one statue. It's the story of countless artifacts. Look at the British Museum, the Louvre, the Met. What do you see? You see the spoils of empire. You see the Rosetta, stone, the Benin bronzes, the Elgin marbles. These aren't just beautiful objects. They are stolen history, ripped from their context. We're told they were discovered or excavated by brave European archaeologists. But let's call it what it was. Looting on an industrial scale, often justified by racist ideologies that deemed the local people unfit to care for their own heritage. Think about the sheer audacity. Imagine someone breaking into your home, taking your family heirlooms, and then putting them on display in their living room, claiming they're preserving them for you. It's absurd, right? Yet this is exactly what happened to entire civilizations. These artifacts were not found in empty lands. They were taken from living cultures, often through violence, coercion, or deceit. They were part of active religious sites, royal courts, and community life. Now, let's talk about the silent cover-up. The part of the story that's often left out of the museum placard. When you look at many of these ancient statues, particularly from Egypt, you might notice something is missing: the noses. For years, the official explanation was simple. Erosion, the wind, the sand, the passage of time. It sounds plausible, doesn't it? But is it the whole truth? Many scholars and historians are now challenging this narrative. They argue that much of this damage wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. Why would someone intentionally break the nose of a statue? In ancient Egyptian belief, statues were seen as vessels for the soul. To breathe, the spirit needed a nose. Smashing the nose was an act of iconoclasm, a way to ritually kill the statue and sever its connection to the divine or the person it represented. This was done by rival pharaohs, by early Christians trying to erase paganism, and yes, by Colonial Archaeology, some 19th century archaeologists, steeped in the racist pseudoscience of their time, couldn't accept that a great civilization could have been built by black Africans. So they defaced the evidence. They broke the broad noses and full lips that linked these ancient rulers to the people of the continent. It was a way of erasing blackness from history, of making it easier to claim this heritage as their own. So the next time you walk through a museum, look closer. Look past the beautiful lighting and the hushed reverence. Ask yourself, how did this get here? Whose hands first touched it? Whose history is being told? And whose is being silenced? The display case isn't a neutral space. It's a political one. It's the final scene of a crime, a silent testament to a history of extraction and erasure. The conversation about restitution is growing louder, and it's a conversation we all need to be a part of. These objects are more than just art. They are the soul of a people, and it's time for them to go home. And here's the part that really stinks. Once these artifacts were taken from their homes and shipped thousands of miles away to Europe, they didn't just change location, they changed identity. Suddenly, these sacred objects, these pieces of history, were being interpreted through colonial eyes. And let's be honest, colonial eyes had a very specific agenda. It was an uncomfortable one. and it was built on a lie. You see, for centuries, Europe had been telling itself a story about Africa. A convenient story that justified their actions. It was a story that painted a picture of a continent that was primitive, a place with no real civilization, no great history to speak of. It was a narrative designed to make one group feel superior and another inferior. But the artifacts told a completely different story. They were the inconvenient truth. These statues, these bronzes, these carvings, they didn't whisper, they screamed. They screamed of intelligence, of advanced engineering, of a deep understanding of astronomy and mathematics. They showcased breathtaking art and undeniable power. They were physical proof that Africa was never behind the world. In fact, Africa helped build the world. The continent was a cradle of innovation, culture, and sophisticated societies long before European ships ever appeared on the horizon. And that truth clashed violently with colonial ideology. It was a direct contradiction to the narrative they had so carefully constructed. So, what do you do when the evidence doesn't fit your story? You change the evidence, or, more accurately, you change how it's presented. Instead of celebrating these objects as proof of advanced African civilizations, they were often labeled as primitive art or tribal crafts. The complex societies that created them were downplayed or ignored entirely. The Benin bronzes, for example, were so sophisticated that early European scholars couldn't believe they were made by Africans. They came up with wild theories, suggesting they must have been made by lost Portuguese artisans, or even ancient Egyptians, anyone but the Edo people themselves. It was a systematic effort to silence the true story these artifacts were trying to tell. The museums became stages, and the artifacts were props in a play that reinforced colonial superiority. The narrative was controlled. The labels were carefully worded. The context was stripped away. What was once a symbol of a king's divine right became just a curious, exotic object in a glass case. This wasn't just collecting. It was an intellectual and cultural suppression. The history wasn't just stolen, it was rewritten. And for over a century, the world has been looking at this edited version of history, displayed in the grand halls of Western museums. The cover-up wasn't just silent, it was deafening. Let's talk about something subtle that happens in museums, something that isn't always violent or obvious, but is incredibly powerful. It's a silent cover-up, a rewriting of history that happens right in front of our eyes, on the little plaques and descriptions next to ancient artifacts. You see, for decades, a quiet change has been taking place. The language used to describe who these ancient people were has been systematically altered. It's a strategy of doubt, a way to muddy the waters of history. Take, for example, a bust of an ancient ruler with clear African features. Where the label once might have accurately read African king, you'll now find something vague, like Near Eastern type. A powerful sculpture of a black ruler. The description has changed to Mediterranean features. And what about a depiction of a proud Nubian queen? Suddenly, she's of uncertain origin. That word, uncertain, is a weapon. It shows up everywhere. You'll see it time and time again, even when the evidence is staring you right in the face. Even when the sculptures, the paintings, and the historical records are clear. Even when the features are obvious and undeniable, they still write uncertain. Why? Because when you repeat a word enough, it starts to sound like the truth. Doubt becomes policy. And when doubt becomes the official policy of our most trusted institutions, it does one thing very effectively. It hides the truth. It erases entire legacies, whitewashes history, and denies people their heritage. This isn't just about dusty artifacts and glass cases. It's about who gets to claim a place in history. The language on these labels matters because it shapes our understanding of the past and, by extension, our understanding of the present. They're replacing Afrikaan with uncertain, black with Mediterranean, and Nubian with unknown. It's a subtle shift, but it's a deliberate one. It's an attempt to remove Africa from its own history, one label at a time. And by doing so, they are not just misrepresenting artifacts. They are silencing the voices and legacies of entire civilizations. We need to start questioning this language. When you walk through a museum and see the word uncertain, ask yourself, uncertain for whom and why? The truth is often not as uncertain as they would like us to believe. We have to look closer, read between the lines, and demand that our institutions tell the whole, unvarnished story. You know, sometimes this whitening of history went even further than just scrubbing off the paint. There are documented cases, and this is where it gets really insidious, where ancient statues were restored. Now, on the surface, restoration sounds like a good thing. It sounds harmless. Preservation, taking care of our past. But restoration, in this context, can mean something else entirely. It can mean reshaping, recarving. Imagine this. A restorer, chisel in hand, isn't just cleaning a statue. They're smoothing out features that seem too ethnic. They're narrowing a nose that seems too broad, softening lips that appear too full. Bit by bit, they are Europeanizing these ancient faces. These are tiny changes, often so subtle that most people looking at the final product would never notice. You'd have to compare it to the original, pre-restoration photos to see the difference. But these small alterations are big enough to completely shift the identity of the person depicted. Because when you change the face, you change the perceived race. And when you change the race, you change the entire narrative. This wasn't just accidental. It was a deliberate act to align these ancient civilizations with a European ideal. Let's take the Great Sphinx of Giza, for example. For centuries, European travelers and scholars described its features as distinctly African. But over time, especially after colonial influence grew, that description started to change. There are accounts and sketches from the 18th and 19th centuries that show a systematic erosion of its original features, not just from time, but from deliberate damage. The nose is the most famous part that's missing. And while the exact cause is debated, this loss conveniently helped to de-Africanize one of the world's most iconic monuments. It's a pattern we see repeated. Statues from ancient Egypt, from Nubia, from Mesopotamia cultures with deep African and Middle Eastern roots were subtly altered to fit a Greco-Roman mold. The goal was to create a historical lineage that flowed directly and exclusively to Europe. By making these powerful ancient figures look more European, it reinforced the colonial idea that civilization, art, and power were inherently European concepts. It allowed them to claim these histories as their own, while simultaneously erasing the people who actually created them. Think about the psychological impact of this. 4 generations. People have walked through the halls of the world's most famous museums and seen a version of history that has been literally whitewashed. They see statues of powerful pharaohs and queens that look vaguely European and subconsciously absorb the message that the great achievements of the ancient world were the work of people who looked like them. This creates a false sense of historical inheritance and superiority. Meanwhile, for people of African, Middle Eastern, or other non-European descent, it creates a profound sense of disconnection from their own heritage. When you don't see yourself represented accurately in the story of human civilization, it can feel like your ancestors didn't contribute, that they were merely on the sidelines of history. This erasure is a form of cultural violence. It robs people of their legacy and perpetuates harmful myths about race and capability. So the next time you're in a museum and you're looking at an ancient statue, especially one from Egypt or the surrounding regions, look closely. Look at the nose, the lips, the shape of the face. Ask yourself, does this reflect the people of that region, or does it reflect a later European ideal? Question what you're seeing. The silent cover-up of our shared history is all around us, carved in stone. But it's a silence we can break by learning to see what's really there, and what's been deliberately taken away. This is a conversation we need to keep having. Think about how dangerous that is. A statue survives 3,000 years of desert storms, wind, and sand, only to be corrected in a European workshop. Corrected. As if the original African features were some kind of mistake, as if history itself needed editing. That's not preservation. That's manipulation. It's a quiet violence against the past, rewriting features to fit a more comfortable, more Eurocentric narrative. It's the ultimate act of historical gaslighting, telling an entire civilization that their image wasn't good enough, that it needed to be fixed. And once you start seeing it, you can't unsee it. You walk through these grand halls and you start to question everything. What else has been altered? What stories have been silenced with a chisel and hammer? And then there's something else. Something most people never even think about when they visit a museum. We see the polished floors, the perfectly lit displays, the little placards with neat descriptions. But what we're seeing is just the tip of the iceberg. The real story, the vast majority of the collection, is hidden Hawaii. I'm talking about the storage rooms, not the exhibits, not the pretty galleries, but the basements, the climate-controlled archives where thousands upon thousands of artifacts sit unseen. They are crated, stacked, and cataloged, but they are never displayed. They are never discussed in the public sphere. And you have to ask yourself, why? Why would a museum acquire these priceless pieces of history only to lock them away in the dark? The answer is uncomfortable. It's because not everything fits the story they want to tell. Every museum, whether consciously or not, curates a narrative. It's a story of art, of history, of civilization. But that story has been predominantly written by a very specific group of people. And when an artifact challenges that narrative, when it shows a history that's more complex, more diverse, or more inconvenient than the accepted version, it becomes a problem. What do you do with a piece that proves a primitive society was actually highly advanced, or an artifact that clearly shows cultural exchange, where the official story claims there was only conquest? You don't have to destroy it. That would be too obvious, too crude. Instead, you just quietly remove it from view. It disappears into the archives. It's not destroyed, just hidden. And hiding something can be just as effective as destroying it. Because if nobody ever sees it, if no one is there to ask questions about it, it might as well not exist. It's a silent cover-up, a form of censorship that happens right under our noses, and the very institutions we trust to preserve our collective memory. The artifacts are safe. Technically, they're preserved, but the stories they hold, the truths they could tell, are effectively silenced. They're trapped in a state of suspended animation, waiting for a time when we're finally ready to hear their full story. This isn't just about a few forgotten pots or statues in a basement. This is about the integrity of our history. It's about who gets to decide what is remembered and what is forgotten. When we walk into a museum, we're not just looking at old objects. We are consuming a story, and we have to be critical about who is telling that story and what they might be leaving out. The real work of understanding history often begins by asking what isn't on display. We need to demand more transparency. We need to ask for the keys to the basement, metaphorically speaking. Imagine this. Your ancestors built magnificent monuments, structures that have defied time and survived for millennia. Imagine the pride, the connection you'd feel to that legacy, and then one day, someone takes them. They don't ask. They is a take. They're shipped thousands of miles away, across vast oceans, to a foreign land. They're put behind cold, sterile glass in a sprawling museum, and right next to these pieces of your heritage, someone writes a new story. A story that isn't quite right. It's their version, their interpretation. It erases the context, simplifies the complexity. And sometimes, it's just plain wrong. And the final irony, they charge you money to see your own history. Think about that. That's not education. That's possession. It's not preservation for all. It's narrative control. It's a continuation of a very old story. What we could call intellectual colonization. Remember our original question from the start of this journey? Who chiseled the noses off the statues? It seems like a simple question, but the answer is anything but. By now, I hope you realize something. Chilling, it wasn't just one group of people. It wasn't just one era in history. This desecration happened in layers, like the peeling of an onion, each layer revealing a different story of erasure. First, you have ancient invaders. Rival kingdoms and conquering armies would often deface the symbols of the rulers they overthrew. It was a power move, a way of saying, your gods are powerless. Your kings are forgotten. They chipped away at the identity of their predecessors, asserting their own dominance. Then came the religious iconoclasm. As new faiths swept across the continent and the world, adherents of these new beliefs sometimes saw the old gods and sacred figures as pagan idols that needed to be destroyed. It was a zealous act, born from a conviction that they were purifying the land. They broke the statues, burned the temples, and chiseled the faces to destroy their spiritual power. And then, we enter a more recent and perhaps more insidious phase, the era of colonial collectors and European archaeologists. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, as European powers carved up Africa, they didn't just take land and resources. They took history. Expeditions, often funded by museums back home, swarmed ancient sites. They saw themselves as discoverers and saviors of these artifacts, ignoring the fact that these objects already belonged to living cultures. The damage they did was twofold. First, the physical act of removal was often brutal. Statues were sawn apart for easier transport. Sites were excavated with a shocking lack of care, destroying invaluable archaeological context forever. But the second form of damage was intellectual. Once these artifacts were in Western museums, a new narrative was constructed. Scholars, steeped in the racial biases of their time, struggled to accept that magnificent civilizations like ancient Egypt or Nubia were African. They proposed theories of foreign influence, suggesting that these achievements must have come from outside the continent. This is where the silent cover-up truly takes hold. By controlling the interpretation, they controlled the perception of history itself. The narratives they wrote often downplayed the African identity of these civilizations, creating a distorted view that has persisted for generations. So, when we look at that noseless statue, we're seeing the work of many different hands over many centuries, all contributing to the same outcome. Ancient invaders, religious zealots, colonial collectors, and biased scholars. Different motivations, different methods, but the result is the same. African identity blurred, history obscured, a legacy fractured. It happened over and over and over again. This isn't just about stone and gold. It's about memory, identity, and the right of a people to tell their own story. The fight to reclaim these artifacts is also the fight to reclaim that narrative. But here's the thing they didn't expect. Stone remembers. Science remembers. DNA remembers. And now, people are asking questions. A new generation of historians, brilliant African scholars, and fiercely independent researchers are looking closer. They're zooming in, examining the microscopic tool marks on these ancient artifacts. They're dusting off old excavation photos, poring over the details that were once overlooked. They're reading forgotten journals, the private thoughts and hurried notes of those early colonial archaeologists. And as they connect the dots, they're realizing something incredibly powerful. The damage isn't random. The broken pieces, the missing fragments, the conveniently lost context, it wasn't just a series of unfortunate accidents. The story that we've been told, the one presented in pristine museum cases, isn't accidental either. The erasure, the silencing of a whole civilization's achievements, was systematic. Think about that for a second. It wasn't just about digging up treasures. It was about digging up a history and then deliberately breaking it. It was about controlling the narrative. They chose which pieces to display and which to hide. They decided which stories were worth telling and which were to be buried all over again. This systematic erasure served a purpose. By presenting these incredible African achievements as primitive, or even as the work of some lost foreign civilization, it reinforced the colonial agenda. It created a justification for their presence, a narrative that they were bringing civilization to a land that supposedly had none. It was a calculated act of historical vandalism on a massive scale. It's a difficult truth to confront, but we have it too. The evidence is there, hidden in plain sight, in the very chisel marks and fractures of the stone. The silence from the past is finally being broken, and the real story, the one that was intentionally shattered, is being pieced back together. Have you ever walked into a museum and felt like you were only getting half the story? That feeling is real. For centuries, our most prestigious institutions have been complicit in a silent cover-up, especially when it comes to colonial archaeology. They present artifacts as simple relics of the past, but there's so much more. They are pieces of a story, often a story of conquest, appropriation, and erasure. Think about it. We see beautiful objects in glass cases, with neat little labels telling us where they're from and how old they are. But what don't those labels say? They don't tell us how these objects were acquired. Were they gifts? Were they traded fairly? Or were they taken by force during a colonial invasion? Too often, it's the last one. And the museum's silence helps to whitewash a violent history. Archaeology itself was a tool of empire. European explorers and archaeologists would descend on colonized lands, digging up sacred sites and ancestral burial grounds without any regard for the local people. They called it science, discovery. But for the communities whose heritage was being unearthed and shipped away, It was desecration. These weren't just objects, they were cultural lifelines, items with deep spiritual significance, and human remains of ancestors. They were taken to film museums back in Europe, displayed as trophies of a superior civilization's global reach. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. You walk into a museum differently. You don't just admire the art. You investigate. You look for what's missing. You notice the broken noses on statues, the vague labels, the half-told stories. You start asking questions. Who wrote this description? Who decided this object's identity? Who benefits from this particular version of history being told? Because history isn't just about the past. It's about power in the present. The narratives that museums create shape how we see ourselves and others. They can reinforce old colonial hierarchies, or they can challenge them. When museums hide the violent origins of their collections, they perpetuate the idea that this history doesn't matter, that the descendants of the colonized have no claim to their own heritage. Reclaiming the truth is about more than just correcting a historical record. It's about restoring dignity. It's about reclaiming power. So next time you're in a museum, don't just look. Investigate. Ask the hard questions. Demand the full story. But we're not done yet, because there's another layer to this story. An even deeper one that gets right to the core of the problem. Science. Or what was called science at the time. I'm talking about anthropology and the dark history of race theory. This was the period when people literally measured skulls, trying to prove that Africans were an inferior race. It was a time when so-called experts used fake, biased science to justify rewriting the histories of entire civilizations. And trust me, what they did to African history during this era might be the most shocking part of this whole story. This wasn't just about stealing artifacts. It was about stealing a narrative, erasing a legacy, and replacing it with a colonial invention. They looked at incredible achievements, like Great Zimbabwean, and instead of giving credit to the local Shona people who built it, they invented phantom builders from distant lands. Why? Because their racist worldview couldn't accept the idea of a sophisticated African civilization. They claimed it must have been built by ancient Phoenicians, or Arabs, or even the Queen of Sheba Newan, but the actual people who lived there. This scientific racism provided the perfect justification for colonialism. If you can convince the world, and even the people themselves, that they have no history of achievement, no culture of their own, it becomes much easier to dominate them. You're not destroying a civilization. You're civilizing a supposedly backward people. This was the intellectual weapon they used, and its effects were devastating. They didn't just take objects from the ground. They took history from the people. And these twisted theories, born from prejudice, found their way into textbooks, lectures, and museum displays, poisoning our understanding of the past 4 generations. The lie became the accepted truth. We'll explore exactly how they pulled this off, and the brilliant minds who fought back to reclaim their history. Stick around, because this is where the story gets really intense.